Hello, and welcome to Thinking Outside the Textbook, Broadening Inclusion, Malleability, and Critical Thinking. My name is James Lange, and after a short introduction, I will be jumping into a talk about exactly what we can do as instructors to try to assist in a greater dialogue within the classroom. So first, a little bit about myself. I'm an English instructor who has 9 years of experience teaching both on ground and online. And through my years of teaching, I've noticed some patterns in how students learn and how students react to an instructor's teaching methodologies. Students rely on the practices used by the instructor to learn the material presented to them in the course. And for this reason, how an instructor chooses to teach his or her course plays a very, very important role in determining how students are going to react and respond to what they're learning and how their instructor is presenting themselves inside the classroom. In turn, it's important to also remember that every student learns differently and that an instructor can't just try to develop a single method for teaching every single student the same exact way. And for this reason, there are complications in the classroom because an instructor has to try to develop ways to maintain an active dialogue in the classroom that is inclusive to all students. It can be difficult to try to accomplish this when each student has a unique learning style that the instructor may not be aware of, and with time constraints and other factors that can inhibit an instructor's ability to try to reach out to a student and learn his or her particular methods for trying to learn the course material. But at the same time, with the restrictions of an instructor's office hours, an ability to be reached, and sometimes even ability to understand how to assist a student, he or she must try to maintain the open-mindedness of knowing that his or her teaching methodologies may have to continuously change and evolve over time. This can present a complication when an instructor is trying to refine his or her teaching abilities, because at the same time that he or she is trying to figure out a particular way to teach students, it can be difficult to gauge how effectively an instructor is reaching students until he or she has graded assignments. And also, an instructor may have trouble trying to gauge because of the amount of students who are showing up to class and also the sheer number of students he or she has to teach throughout a term. Additionally, because of the recent technological boom, instructors are not only discovering that students learn differently, but they are also learning that students have more resources that have altered the way that they approach the educational experience. With the online world, and with the way that the online world is set up, more and more students are turning towards sites that have pre-written papers and other methods that allow them to simply purchase education rather than try to learn the material that's being presented within a course. Instructors are being faced with the task of trying to engage students, have them be interested, and also have them learn the course material so that they are able to move past the course and advance their education as they move throughout completing their degree. These complications, paired with the expectation for the instructor to prove his or her ability as an effective educator, causes for one to have to try to develop methodologies that are going to reaffirm his or her standing as an instructor. These methods can be difficult to develop when an instructor is still trying to gauge the learning styles of his or her classroom. Depending on the format and layout of the classroom, an instructor may have difficulty trying to gauge how effectively his students are learning. In an on-ground classroom, it is not uncommon for an instructor to be met with blank stares and silence during lecture, and in an online classroom, it is not uncommon for an instructor to receive no responses from the remarks he or she has made on the discussion board. So how do we as instructors respond to the blank stares of students and the silence of the classroom? How should we try to inspire students to speak up in a culture where students are often afraid to speak up for fear of looking stupid or for fear of being wrong? What approach should instructors use to try to assist students also in knowing that even though they may not fully understand what they're learning, a part of the academic process is trying to participate in an ongoing discussion with your peers? How can we shift students' focus from trying to learn what the instructor quote unquote wants when reading and reviewing an assignment and redirect students to trying to focus on the learning experience they are having while in the course? In a culture focused on trying to promote the idea that education equates to job prospects and economic worth, how can we try to redirect students towards focusing on the educational experience and the material that they're learning in the course? So how do we as instructors move away from a traditional pedagogy of teaching and try to move towards a more atypical style of approaching how to engage students? Is there a way for us to remain malleable while trying to refine our teaching abilities and also learn how to reach a broad audience while also being able to address the individual needs of every student? As we move forward, we'll take a look at some of the different styles and approaches that instructors have begun to use in order to try to be certain that they are reaching as many students as possible when teaching a course. While looking over these different styles of teaching, we'll review the similarities and differences between each of the different styles and assess how effectively we could try to formulate a teaching style that involves each of the different approaches. As we begin reviewing the different approaches that are used to teach, you may want to try to consider comparing your own teaching styles to the ones that we are reviewing. As you'll see in each of the different styles, the approaches that are used are geared towards addressing the student's unique learning approach. While reviewing the different styles of teaching, you may also want to try to measure your opinions of each of the different teaching styles. For instance, if there is a certain teaching style that you agree with, you may want to ask yourself why you agree with it. Whereas if there's also a teaching style that you don't agree with, you may want to try to question the reasons why you don't think the teaching style works. Assessing our own personal preferences and biases in regards to the teaching process will assist each of us in trying to move forward and remain malleable and open-minded to the different approaches that individuals use to try to reach a broad audience of students. You may want to try to list all of the different methods and practices you use to try to foster critical thinking skills in your classroom. Do you try to mainly engage your students through discussion, or through assignments, or through the course reading? Are there particular aspects of the analytical thinking process that you feel take time for students to learn, or that they should be able to quickly pick up on after stepping into the classroom? If you feel your students aren't meeting the requirements of the course or off base from the goals that you have set forth for them, what methods and practices do you use to try to redirect students back toward the learning outcomes for the course? How do you develop your syllabi? Do you build on each week in your course, or do you treat each week as a separate concept? So if students are having trouble one week, in the following week they may be able to grasp a different concept and thus feel more comfortable in the course and their ability to understand the course material. If you notice that students are having difficulty in your course, do you try to change your teaching methodologies mid-course, or do you try to continue on and see what students are able to benefit from your teaching methodologies and which aren't. When a course has ended, do you use the results of your course to try to determine new ways you can refine your teaching methodologies, or do you just write it off as the student's ability or inability to learn the course material? How do the national statistics of student performance influence your perception of your student? Do you feel as if you have an ageist bias towards your students? Do you feel as if you're more easily able to relate to the students who are the same age as you or older than you, more than you're able to relate to the students who are coming in from Generation Y and Generation Z? What techniques do you use to try to relate to each generation of students you have coming into your classroom? Do you feel as if there are particular topics you can talk about in every course you teach that every student is going to be able to relate to? How do you balance the different reactions from students who are taking your course? Do you feel as if there's a certain amount of engagement that needs to happen in course discussion in order for your students to fully be able to learn the course material? Is it mainly through class discussion that your students are able to not only learn from you, but learn from their peers as well? Additionally, how do you respond to student feedback? Are you able to be receptive to everything that students are writing to you? Do you feel as if students are trying to justify their performance more than they're trying to express to you what could be changed about their course to further their learning experience? Do you feel as if your own judgments play into how you respond to the feedback that you receive from students? Are you seeing them as your academic equals, or are you seeing them more as the student body that either did or did not understand what you were trying to convey to them throughout the course? Do you feel as if you're able to remain entirely unbiased in the course? How do you respond to students of different genders, sexual orientations, or cultural backgrounds? Do you feel as if any of these factors may also contribute to unconscious favoritism towards students? How do you continuously try to evaluate yourself throughout the duration of your course? Do you feel as if you're able to try different approaches within a single term, or do you feel as if as soon as you outline the approach you want to use, you continue to use that same approach throughout the entirety of your class? How do you try to measure how effectively your tone is working for the course? Do you feel as if you start out a course too friendly, then students won't be able to see you as professional? Do you find yourself more concerned of how students are perceiving you rather than how they are responding to the material you are teaching them? Do you feel as if, as long as the majority of students seem to be grasping the material, you do not find yourself trying as hard to try to reach out to the students who seem to have difficulty? Do you find yourself subscribing to the idea that not everyone will do well in your class? Do you feel as if you have enough opportunity to try to address every concern you have for your course? Or do you find that typically, because of time constraints, you have to continue pressing on with the course material without having the chance to fully address matters of concern that you have started to note throughout the course? Do you feel as if your identity as the instructor inhibits your ability to try to explain to students that you have reevaluated the approach you are using to discuss certain texts and concepts? How easy do you feel it is for you to be able to make an announcement to your class that you are trying to continue learning course material alongside your students? Do you feel as if being anything but authoritative in your classroom will cause for students to stop respecting you and responding to you during course discussion? Do you feel as if when opening a dialogue in the classroom, you have to be able to respond to every response being made by a student? How comfortable are you with having moments when you can actually simply respond to a student by saying, "I don't know, but this is something I can reflect on and we can discuss more later"? Alongside this question, do you feel as if you are able to create enough balance to continue learning when you are also teaching a course? Do you feel as if the demands of being an instructor prevent you from having enough time to continue to pursue your own studies? Do you feel as if a course does not revolve around your own interests, you yourself have a difficult time trying to take an interest in what you're teaching? How does having to remain within course requirements, course availability, and the types of courses you are qualified to teach affect the way you feel about your teaching experience? Do many of your interests stand outside of the degree you hold? Do you feel as if a lot of your skills can continue to be transferred to other courses? If you are teaching a course where you have control over the syllabi, do you feel as if you are able to craft your topic around your interests while also still teaching each of the requirements for the course? What do you do if you feel as if students aren't receptive to the topic you have chosen for your course? With the vast amount of different interests that students have, do you feel as if you are able to find the subject matters that will be engaging for the entire student body? How often and how effectively do you feel you are able to continuously reinvent your curriculum? Furthermore, do you feel as if you wear a certain persona within the classroom? How does your persona affect the way that students respond to you? Do you feel as if who you present yourself as within the classroom is a fair representation of how you intend to grade your students throughout the course? How do you respond if a student feels confused by the remarks you put on an assignment in comparison to how they were viewing you within the context of class discussions? How do you respond to a student's feeling as if you are not the same person when grading that you are when trying to talk about subject matters and sharing your expertise? Do you also feel a certain amount of pressure to try to pass students and also give students grades that they may not have earned in your eyes because of the pressure to have a certain pass and fail ratio within the classroom? How do pressures from department heads also affect your performance in the classroom? Do you feel as if you have to change your teaching methodologies to try to keep your position and standing within the department? How much of your teaching performance is still tied to the politics of the university you are teaching for? Do you feel as if how you act in the classroom and how you grade your students is dependent upon the feedback that you are receiving from your peers and the people who work above you? Do you feel as if you are part of a community of educators, or do you feel as if you work as an independent contractor who must continuously prove his or her worthiness of the position he or she holds? If you have concerns about the course you're teaching, do you feel comfortable in going to your superior and explaining your situation, or do you feel as if trying to explain your situation will only be met with you're being reprimanded? How do the hierarchies of teaching cause you to act around your peers and your superiors? Do you feel as if you must always remain within the strict guidelines you were given for what it means to be an effective instructor for the university or college that you're teaching for? How does the frequency of your teaching also affect your performance and comfort within the classroom? If you aren't teaching consistently from term to term and have a varied course load, how do these factors affect how you perceive your experience when teaching? Do you feel you are allotted enough time to fully teach each course? And how do the perceptions of your courses change with each additional course you are adding onto your course load? At some point, do you feel as if the grading process takes up the majority of your time? Do you feel as if you have a limited amount of time you can offer to students who are seeking assistance? Furthermore, for difficult materials, what do you try to do to be certain your students are absorbing what they are hearing from you? Do you pause during lecture to check in with students in order to be certain that they are understanding the material? Do you feel as if there's enough time to try to correct students' thinking if you find that a student says something that does not completely align with what you are trying to teach? What approaches do you use to try to determine how to use your allotted amount of time for teaching each course you have. Even if you've been teaching a course for an extended period of time, do you feel as if you have full expertise in what you are teaching, or do you still feel as if you are a student in your own course? Lastly, after assessing the effectiveness of the techniques you've already used within your classroom, what do you feel will assist you the most in continuing to refine your instructional abilities? Do you feel as if the university or college that you teach for provide you with enough resources to assist you in continuing to grow as an instructor? Do you find that it is primarily comparing your experiences with your peers that you are able to find out how others are experiencing teaching? Do you feel as if it is through collaboration that you are able to continue to uncover what techniques are working effectively to reach students and what techniques aren't? Do you feel as if collaborating with others will also assist you in determining if the experiences you are having within your classroom are unique or similar to the overall experiences being had by your peers? How do the changing attitudes towards the subject matters you teach also affect how students will respond to you within the classroom? How do the changing attitudes towards the subject matters you teach also affect how students will respond to you within the classroom? What strategies and fail-safes will you use if any issues arise within your classroom? What techniques will you use to be certain you are remaining entirely receptive to the students you have within your classroom? So after that long list of questions, let's start to discuss the different techniques that are actually used to try to teach students. In the article Improving Students' Learning with Effective Learning Techniques, John Dunlosky, Catherine A. Rawson, Elizabeth J. Marsh, Mitchell J. Nathan, and Daniel T. Willingham try to discuss particular methods that have proven effective for student learning. Of the various techniques that are used to teach students, 5 particular techniques are highlighted by these authors, and each is detailed in regards to the approach it uses to try to engage students. The 5 techniques that are mentioned are summarization, highlighting, the keyword mnemonic, imagery used for text learning, and rereading. Apart from discussing how students learn differently, the authors of this article discuss how each of these 5 different techniques can be used to try to promote student learning. Of the 5 different techniques that were previously mentioned, the authors have tried to measure how each of the different techniques is able to contribute to improved memory for target material by measuring students' comprehension of the materials being discussed. The measurements for students' retention has not only been measured through tests, but also by their ability to try to teach others what they have learned themselves. This method for measuring student retention, as asserted by the authors, will reveal that students aren't only trying to memorize information, but also are able to utilize what they've learned. A subsection of the first technique of trying to teach students is referred to as elaborative interrogation. An example of elaborative interrogation actually occurred earlier in this presentation when I was posing a long string of questions. What I was attempting to do was try to foster your critical thinking. By posing questions rather than providing answers, an instructor is enabling a student to try to reflect more on his or her personal understanding of the subject matter being discussed. Elaborative interrogation also works very effectively to try to promote more discussion within the classroom, even if it is only discussion between the instructor and the student. Elaborative instruction can also be performed both in the classroom and on graded assignments. Providing elaborative interrogation on an assignment can also greatly benefit a student by allowing him or her to have an extended period of time to reflect on what the instructor is asking. Because the overall purpose of academic discussion is to keep the discussion going, by providing elaborative interrogation, an instructor is not only inviting his or her students to participate in the discussion being had, but it is also reinforcing that the students are also a part of the discussion. However, something an instructor may want to keep in mind if he or she decides to use elaborative interrogation is to be mindful of the language he or she is using when posing questions to students. If possible, an instructor should aim to try to use keywords and terms that a student will be able to recognize and also relate back to the course material he or she is learning in the classroom. Depending on the course being taught, an instructor can also use language towards his or her students depending on where they are in the program of study and what terms they may have also learned in their previous courses. Teaching students about the interconnectedness between different subjects of study within a particular discipline will also allow them to learn that there is intersectionality between their different subjects of study. Depending on the type of course you're teaching, you may also want to try to implement the second style used to try to communicate ideas to students. A subsection of summarizing is referred to as self-explanation. In self-explanation, an instructor uses a very basic presentation of information, similar to in mathematics, where a set value is given to certain terms. Self-explanation uses a very similar method. The information being presented is shown to have an absolute and singular value. This teaching approach would be beneficial if you were trying to do instructions for a math course or a similar course where there are only specific values given to the information you're presenting to your students. On the other hand, another teaching method that involves a less concrete approach and more creative approach is imagery used for text learning. Imagery used for text learning affords a student the opportunity to use his or her own imagination and creativity to try to develop methods to learn and retain the information being presented to them. Though teaching students how to use imagery to learn and retain information may take more time, the benefits of teaching students these methods can continue on throughout their educational experiences. Once a student learns a more creative method to learning information, he or she can continue to refine that method and begin learning material by not only using logic, but also creativity. Conversely, returning back to one of the more systematic approaches to learning information, the authors call attention to trying to use the process of suggesting to a student that he or she should continuously reread the text materials that are being discussed within the classroom. The authors not only provide statistical evidence as to how effective rereading can be for students, but they also mention that some students simply learn differently. This will be something that is important to keep in mind when trying to implement some of these teaching styles into your course. Because of the time restraints of your course, you may only want to try to implement one learning style per each course that you're teaching. However, if you're teaching a combination of courses in one term, you may want to try a different learning style in each course and see how your students are reacting to each of the different learning styles. Lastly, another learning style you can try to implement into your course is the keyword mnemonic. This approach, as discussed by the authors, involves a student trying to find words that are similar to the new terms that are being introduced to them within the classroom. He or she can develop a relation to the new terms being introduced to him or her from the vocabulary he or she already possesses. This method is not something as much as an instructor can try to assist a student with, but it is an idea that the instructor can present to students at the beginning of the course. An instructor is presenting to students the idea that they maintain the ability to learn outside of the classroom will also assist them in reminding that not only does the instructor possess knowledge, but students are also able to pursue the knowledge that they themselves seek. Revisiting the topic of a student having his or her own specific style of learning, as well as his or her responsibility in his or her own learning, provides a perfect segue into our next article for discussion. Susan M. Montgomery and Linda N. Grote, in Student Learning Styles and Their Implications for Teaching, discuss how students learn differently and how students are able to try to retain information depending on their learning style. Both of the authors highlight the importance of making teaching and learning a dialogue rather than just a one-way conversation. The authors highlight the critical importance of education's remaining a dialogue between students and their instructor, by detailing that it is only through remaining in a dialogue that instructors can be sure that their message is being heard by the students correctly, and that the lessons they are teaching are being properly learned and retained by students. If an instructor is not fully engaged in trying to measure how much of his or her lessons are being retained by the students in his or her classroom, then the instructor at the same time is revealing his or her disinterest in what is taking place in the classroom. Ultimately, the conversation of teaching methodologies comes down to engagement, whether instructors are engaging their students directly, or whether instructors are teaching students to develop methods to help them engage with themselves. Staying active and interested in our own classrooms is very important because, as is pointed out by the authors of the article, it ensures the future of our discipline. Additionally, instructors also need to be certain that they're keeping in mind that not all students will be able to reveal their potential within the physical classroom. Taking into consideration whether students are introverted or extroverted will grant an instructor the opportunity to pause and consider how his or her students prefer to interact with others. A student's being introverted or extroverted will reveal the process they use to try to interact with others. Extroverts tend to be more engaging in the classroom, whereas introverts tend to still absorb class material, but tend to be more of reflective thinkers. An instructor will most likely be engaged by an introverted student through course assignments outside of the classroom, as well as possibly through office hours. Just because a student is introverted does not necessarily mean that he or she has any social phobias. However, an introvert's mode of expressing him or herself may be limited to smaller groups of people and may require the instructor to see him or her in the frame of just being a single person rather than being a part of a collective whole. Considering these factors for potentially introverted students also allows for an instructor to be reminded of the fact that different students might use their senses differently to try to engage themselves with the world that is surrounding them. Taking into consideration how the five senses contribute to an individual's learning material can also allow an instructor to keep in mind that a person's physical body plays a role in determining his or her physical capabilities as well as his or her preferred styles and methods of learning material. Stop and consider for a moment your preferred methods of learning. Have you always preferred to see words on a page, or do you find you retain information better by attending lectures and hearing information spoken to you? How many different forms do you use within your classroom to try to communicate ideas to your students? If you have a disabled student and they ask for accommodations, do you already have materials ready for him or her? Or does a student's request require you to go back and try to recreate the course materials you use to teach the class? Do you already keep recordings of your class lectures just in case you have a student who may need them later? How active do you remain in trying to have on hand as many resources as possible to provide to students to assist in their learning experience? Montgomery and Grote do well to call attention to how your different senses are going to contribute to how you learn in a classroom environment, keeping in mind that students may need more resources than you're typically ready to provide is a great way to make sure that you are staying conscious of the multiple dimensions and different perceptions that are taking place within your classroom every time you meet to talk about course material. If you typically try to have students subscribe themselves to your teaching methods, try to pause for a moment to consider ways you can more effectively try to subscribe yourself to your students' different learning styles. A final point to consider when looking over the article provided by Grote and Montgomery is attitudes. An instructor's attitude as well as a student's attitude are each going to play a very important role in the learning process. It is equally important for both students and instructors to be open to one another and also willing to learn how each party is trying to address the subject matters being discussed. Students are not only bringing their personal experiences to the classroom, but depending on who they are and where they are from, they can also contribute a cultural lens. If a student presents an instructor with constructive criticism, either during class or privately during office hours, an instructor should be open to hearing the student's remarks and not take the constructive criticism personally. Students and educators have the same goal in mind, to try to learn more about topics and also participate in the critical conversation about the topic being discussed. If you find yourself being challenged by students rather than engaged by them, you may want to try to revisit some of the feelings that you have while going throughout the process of teaching your course. Reflecting on these various talking points provides a perfect transition for the next topic we will be discussing in the presentation: classroom management and learning style. A resource provided by California State University Dominguez Hills outlines important key points an instructor should keep in mind when teaching a course. The resource begins by outlining the importance of student-centered perspective in teaching. Student-centered teaching is centered around an instructor's effectively applying and adapting teaching strategies to meet their own goals and their students' needs. This statement succinctly outlines what an instructor should aim to do when teaching a course. By using strategies to teach students, an instructor is revealing his or her interest and dedication to trying to make the information provided in the course as accessible as possible and as malleable as possible. Revealing to students that there are various ways to teach the same course materials will help students feel more comfortable in knowing that they will not have to only learn using one particular method provided by the instructor. An instructor's ability to essentially think on his or her feet while also demonstrating to students how he or she is able to represent information in different ways, granting students the opportunity to see how effectively you are able to continuously show them the same information in different ways will also help your students to feel more comfortable in the classroom. Instead of having to question whether or not they will only be met with an instructor's repeating what he or she has already said before, by being able to present information different ways, an instructor is allowing his or her students to know that they are all able to continuously ask questions without having to feel that they know the instructor's response will only be a reiteration of what the instructor has already said before. If an instructor feels he or she has already mastered the concepts that he or she is teaching to other students, then trying to find different ways to impart the knowledge of the key concepts that are being presented in the course. Demonstrate the instructor's dedication and willingness to make sure that every student is able to fully comprehend the course material and progress in their academic journey. As the resource highlights, teaching is a complex, multifaceted activity often requiring instructors to juggle multiple tasks and goals while also having to remember that they are the ones who possess the power to create conditions that help students learn a great deal of information. Teachers are essentially the storeroom of what a student will learn throughout the duration of a course. Though an instructor may require students to buy certain textbooks in order to participate in class discussions and learn the course materials, it is ultimately the instructor, him or herself, who will explain to students what they should be taking away from the course material. Bearing these factors in mind, it becomes an instructor's responsibility to align his or her objectives and activities with the course materials and how well his or her students are understanding what is being taught. An instructor is required to prioritize his or her expectations for the course to student learning. Therefore, if an instructor is finding that he or she is being too demanding of his or her students, he or she must try to reinvent what tactics he or she will use to be certain that students are still taking away meaning and value from the course materials. Though it puts a large amount of responsibility and pressure on an instructor, it truly is the responsibility of the instructor to provide all available information to students, and to also be certain that he or she is being receptive towards what the students are trying to express to him or her. One approach to doing this is to try to overcome one's expert blind spots. As we've gone through our educational programs, we have put ourselves into a frame of mind where we have convinced ourselves that our success in our classes have also reflected our mastery of the subject matters we've been taught. However, being able to identify and address where we may have not used inclusive thinking in our education, instructors are able to try to continue refining their teaching abilities by remembering that everything we learn and teach is a part of a critical conversation about subject matter. The critical conversation, as it was introduced to me by a fellow instructor almost a decade ago, revolves around the concept that even though students might not have their degrees yet, they are still able to participate and contribute to the analytical conversations being had about subject matters. By having conversations that take place between instructors and students fall under the umbrella of the critical conversation, students will feel like their opinions have value and that their opinions and ideas are wanted and respected within the classroom. Using this method in turn will also allow students to feel more comfortable in the classroom and will most likely increase student engagement. Students, rather than feeling talked at, will feel talked to and will know that their opinion, if different from their instructor, will not be met with the instructor's complete dismissal of their ideas. However, an instructor must also try to address problematic student behavior within the classroom. If a student is making remarks that are causing other students to feel uncomfortable, or is revealing that the student has not read the course material, is making remarks that distract from and interfere with an equally comfortable class discussion for all students, it is an instructor's responsibility to not only show his or her maturity and capability in dealing with problematic moments, as an instructor should be demonstrating to his or her students that he or she can keep class discussion focused without it being derailed by other students trying to interrupt the natural flow of conversation. One technique that an instructor can use, which also ties into both a teaching style and general approach toward academic engagement with students, is preparation. An instructor's ability to be prepared for being thrown off by students, or having already thought through what to do when a classroom remains silent after delivering a lecture, affords the instructor the ability to always have control over the classroom he or she is teaching within. Having a large variety of responses to different situations will also afford the instructor an ability to know that if things start to go awry in a classroom, he or she will have different means of engaging students to try to get them back into the mindset of actively participating in the class. Ultimately, as an instructor is reminded each time he or she steps into the classroom, all student eyes are looking toward the instructor for direction and answers to what is being discussed within the classroom. How an instructor presents him or herself is also very important because it influences how students will perceive of their instructor. You may want to try to examine the behaviors that you exhibit within your classroom. Do you find that your demeanor is inviting to students, or do you find that you are merely the person who's coming into the classroom to explain the information that you are discussing within the context of the course? Do you find that you try to be understanding and accommodating towards students who may be experiencing health problems, personal or family problems, or adjusting to other things that are taking place in their life outside the classroom? If you are experiencing difficulties yourself, do you try to provide any forewarning to your students? Do you try to cancel classes if you feel you have to? Or do you try to continue pressing forward and just teaching the course material? Do you find that how you choose to engage with your students affects their performance within the classroom? Do you find that there are both advantages and disadvantages to the level of professionalism you bring to the course and how you decide to teach it? How much of your personality is a part of your teaching persona? When a course starts, do you try to go over all of the expectations for the course the first day of class? Or do you simply leave your students to read the syllabus to know what will be expected of them throughout the course? With the changing generations and attitudes towards education, do you feel as if your experiences within the classroom have changed for the better or for the worse? Do you feel as if technology has affected your ability to try to reach students? Do you feel as if your teaching methodologies are constantly evolving because of the amount of access you have to technology you can use to teach students? Do you find that students enter your classroom and share with you the technologies that other instructors have used that have proved effective for helping them understand course material? How willing are you to continuously adapt your course lectures and teaching methods so you can try to be more inclusive to all the different learning styles that students have? Do you attempt to try to open up to students about what they will gain from learning the course material? How often do you take into consideration the feedback that you receive from prior students' reactions to your course? Do you feel as if students' reactions to your course give you a fair assessment of how well the class align with the major components of the instructor's learning objectives, assessments, and instructional activities? How effectively does the feedback you receive prepare you for trying to make adjustments to your teaching methodologies and the information that you use to develop your courses? Do you find that you try to identify what key concepts students had concerns with? Do you try to replace course materials that were perceived as being difficult with other course materials that still contain the same meaning and value as what you were trying to express to your students? How often do you allow yourself the ability to try to redevelop your approaches to teaching your course material? Another author who's called attention to the learning styles used by instructors and students alike is Jenna P. Carpenter. Carpenter, in her essay, Using Learning Styles to Improve Student Learning, not only identifies another set of learning styles, but also breaks them up into different categories. Carpenter outlines how there are different learning styles for processing, perception, input, understanding, and organization. Each of these different types of learning plays a vital role in how a student or instructor receives information, interprets information, and responds to the information being provided to him or her. So let's begin with processing learning styles. Processing learning styles are broken up into two different types of learners: active learners and reflective learners. Active learners process actively, think out loud, try out different ideas while learning, and then jump in to what they're learning and enjoy working in groups. Reflexive learners, on the other hand, process information introspectively, work quietly, want to think about what they've just learned and delay jumping into information they've just learned. A reflective learner will also prefer to either work by him or herself or work only in a pair. Assessing how your students process information may assist you in trying to determine what approach you should use to trying to engage with your student body. Understanding not only how your students process information, but also how you process information will assist you in determining what methodologies you can use to be certain that both you and your students are benefiting from the teaching experience and learning experience. Understanding how information is processed by an individual will also assist in understanding how the information is perceived by the individual as well. People tend to perceive information in two different ways. There are sensory learners and intuitive learners. Sensory learners tend to focus on sensory input, are practical learners, observant, think concretely, and like repetition. Intuitive learners, on the other hand, focus on subconscious thoughts, are imaginative, look for meanings in things, and tend to think abstractly, and like variety for modes of thinking and conceiving of different ideas. Depending on the course you're teaching and whether or not the materials you're teaching has a concrete or abstract value will influence whether or not you should be trying to teach students to use more sensory learning or intuitive learning. If a student's general mode of thinking is more sensory based or intuitive based, then an instructor will have to try to lead the student to a new mode of thinking. This process may or may not prove difficult for an instructor depending upon his or her own style of thinking and learning. How one perceives information also has to do with the ways in which one effectively receives information. Some find themselves to be visual learners, while others are verbal learners. Visual learners prefer to have information shown to them and respond best to pictures, diagrams, sketches, schematics, flowcharts, and plots, whereas verbal learners prefer to have information explained to them and respond best to spoken words and written words. When developing a course and teaching a course, it can be beneficial for an instructor to remember to try to use a combination of ways to try to communicate ideas to students. By using a combination of methods to communicate ideas and concepts to students, an instructor will be able to try to create a balance for reaching both styles of learners, while also trying to introduce students to the different styles of learning. Something else to take into consideration is how students understand information. Typically, there are two types of learners. There are sequential learners and global learners. Sequential learners can function with partial understanding, make steady progress, explain easily what they understand, and focus on analysis and details. Whereas global learners need one to provide the big picture in order to understand what is being discussed. Global learners also draw conclusions slowly and then tend to make major leaps in their thinking. Global learners also can't explain ideas easily because they're processing information in the background and also tend to focus on synthesis and systems of thinking. Taking time to consider how students put information together will also assist an instructor in knowing how he or she should approach trying to present information. Depending on the difficulty of the course and the assignments assigned throughout the course, an instructor can greatly improve student responses by trying to formulate methodologies to reach both styles of learners. One last thing an instructor should consider is how his or her students organize the information that is being learned. Inductive learners start with observation and infer and explain information, whereas deductive learners start with principles and then deduce and derive conclusions from the information they're provided with. The majority of the time, deductive learning is referred to as the natural college teaching style and process. However, it's important to take into consideration whether you're teaching a core class or you are teaching a specific class for a major when assessing the expectations you have for your students and how you intend to try to engage with them. For students who are outside the comfort zone of their declared major, you may find that they tend to be more inductive learners than deductive learners. You may find that you can benefit from trying to check in with your classes as the course progresses so you can hear straight from the students who may or may not be having difficulties. Depending on the time restraints of your course, you may want to try to do this by having your students come in one day during office hours or during a time when they would usually be in class so they can speak with you individually about their experiences. Creating a sense of comfortability for students will also allow an instructor to gain insights into how these students are actually responding to the information being taught. If students view an instructor in the typical terms of only seeing him or her as the lecturer and grader of assignments, without ever having the moment where an instructor tries to check in to see if the information is being well received, then an instructor can end up limiting the amount of feedback he receives from students and what he or she can do to try to improve the teaching methodologies used for the course. Though an instructor must set boundaries between him or herself and the students being taught, it is also important for both students and the instructor to know that they can learn from each other and also engage with each other in beneficial ways. As we move towards the conclusion of the presentation, let's try to review the things that an instructor should keep in mind when teaching a course and engaging with students. One very valuable practice for an instructor is for him or her to determine and categorize his or her own teaching style and the approach he or she uses to engage students. Doing this will allow an instructor to know what approaches he or she uses to try to convey the meaning and value of the course material being taught. In turn, these practices will also afford an instructor a greater opportunity to try to determine how to reinvent his or her practices throughout his or her teaching career. Continuously developing new styles and approaches toward teaching will help an instructor to address all styles of learners within his or her classroom. Another approach an instructor should try to use is keeping dialogues open within the classroom, rather than just having the instructor stand there as the individual who possesses all of the knowledge for the course. Opening the course to students sharing their thoughts and feelings and experiences as well will also lend to furthering class discussion and an instructor's ability to engage with his or her students. Another key decision for an instructor to make is determining how he or she will try to present him or herself within the classroom. An instructor may find that he or she presents himself as too friendly or too strict within the beginning of the course, but then may find it more beneficial to try to change his or her persona in the course as the class progresses. Ultimately, determining one's teaching persona is a matter of trial and error and also trying to figure out what the instructor is most comfortable with, while also measuring how effectively he or she is able to engage students and teach the course material. A part of an instructor's teaching experience will also be learning how to evolve with each new generation of students, while also trying to determine what approaches to use to relate to each new generation. With shifting cultural ideals and students having particular standpoints on what they do and don't value, an instructor must try to use his or her ability to relate to generations to continue to develop course material that will be engaging to students. This assertion does not mean that an instructor must only teach what students want to learn, but it does mean that an instructor has to find a way to relate information to students who have a certain way of perceiving of what will contribute to them having a valuable learning experience. Considering the experiences that are being had by the students within the classroom is critical when trying to establish the shared experience of education and learning had between the instructor and student. By students being able to view their instructor as an educational peer, they will feel more comfortable in trying to express themselves within the classroom, rather than strongholding what does and does not prove to be academically viable. An instructor can establish all thoughts that are either grounded in the course materials or the student's personal way of relating to the course materials, can add to the analytical discussions being had within the classroom. These techniques will not only raise engagement from students, but will also reflect how the instructor engages with students in order to create a dialogue about the topics being discussed. These factors, along with the type of course an instructor is teaching, will determine the presence and presentation an instructor has in the course. Whether an instructor decides to utilize technology, and whether or not he or she decides to remain personable, will influence how students respond to the course. Additionally, how the instructor chooses to try to convey the value of learning the course material will determine what meaning students will attribute to taking the course. And ultimately, an instructor's engagement with his or her class will reflect how effectively the students can learn from their instructor and how effectively the instructor can learn from his or her students. Students not only want to learn, but they want to know why what they're learning has value. By an instructor is not only showing his or her interest in teaching every student within his or her course, but also demonstrating that he or she can teach course material in a variety of ways. An instructor is showing their dedication to teaching and also their willingness to have the teaching experience to not only be for the benefit of the students, but the instructor as well. If an instructor's purpose is to teach students, then the greatest knowledge an instructor can impart upon students is to remain open to every aspect of the learning process. This is James Lange signing off. Thank you for attending my lecture.